Innsmouth, stranger.
Greetings, travellers, and welcome to episode 87 of the Innsmouth Book Club podcast. As you can see, we've brought you directly to the library because we're going to be poring over a musty old tome. I'm one of your hosts, Tim Mendes.
And I'm the other one, Rob Hoyton. Yes, we're returning to Mr. Lovecraft today with what rather sadly turned out to be his last published story, The Haunter of the Dark.
Indeed, yeah, his last published story and one of his best, in my opinion. In fact, it's one of my favourites of weird fiction, not just Lovecraft, of all weird fiction. I absolutely love this story. Something to do with the atmosphere, I think.
Absolutely. And I think what we get in this as well, as we were saying just earlier, is there's the story itself, which I imagine most of our listeners will be familiar with. But there's all these little sidebars and bits of information packed in there as well. It really is packed with a lot of sort of mythos stuff and historical stuff. And of course, we'll also talk about the influences on Lovecraft to write this story as well, because there's some interesting things there.
Yeah, and then there's also the stories that kind of bookend it as well, the stories of Robert Bloch stories.
Yeah, it's kind of unique for Lovecraft in that I know he worked with other people on lots of things. I mean, I suppose Houdini Under the Pyramids is a prime example.
Indeed.
But this particular story seemed to spawn, it seemed to spawn, didn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so let's get our copy down from the shelf here and just blow off a little bit of this Innsmouth dust. Be careful not to breathe it in, of course.
Yeah. Infectious spores.
Band name.
Yeah, definitely.
So this was written in November 1935, I believe, and then published the next year?
Yeah, it was written between the 5th and the 9th of November 1935 and was published in the December 1936 edition of Weird Tales. And something that you'll notice as well is that it actually contains an excerpt of a much earlier work of Lovecraft's at the beginning. The epigraph is actually the second stanza from his 1917 poem, Nemesis.
I feel that's quite nice because it almost bookends his career, doesn't it? You've got 1917 and then 1935. One of his first works appears in his last one.
Yeah. There's
a nice circularity about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think Nemesis is a great poem, actually. We might well do a reading of that sometime. It's sort of like a cosmic journey, isn't it? I'm not sure if the being writing it is immortal, or they also talk about lots of past lives as well. It struck me as quite Robert E. Howard in atmosphere, a lot of that poem.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of Lovecraft's better poems, in my opinion.
And as we mentioned, The Haunter of the Dark was a sequel to Robert Bloch's Shambler from the Stars. And there's a dedication to Bloch at the beginning, of course. And in The Shambler from the Stars, young Mr. Bloch did kill off Lovecraft, although, to be fair, he did ask permission.
Indeed. I love this sort of interaction that the two had going on, because Lovecraft wrote back from Cthulhu, wasn't it? He got a certificate giving him permission from Cthulhu, i.e. the great Cthulhu, give young Robert Bloch the permission to... It's just brilliant.
I know, it's wonderful stuff, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, this is one of those things I always bring out when people talk about, he was a humorless hermit kind of thing, because it's so total fallacy, because you read any of these interactions that he has with the Circle, and you just see that simply wasn't true.
Absolutely, as well as being one of the most well-travelled of the Circle, particularly between Howard and Smith, neither of whom travelled that much at all. So,
yeah, I don't think Howard did either, really, did he?
I think he might have gone to Mexico once, and that was pretty much it. I think that was his only time out of Texas.
Yeah,
people forget in those days just what travel was like. Perhaps you couldn't jump on a plane like today. Even a train or a bus ride was a major undertaking, I would think.
Indeed. I always liked Lovecraft's style on that, because he was permanently in a state of pecuniary depletion. What he would do to save himself money was he would book overnight coach journeys to places. So he'd sleep on the coach and save himself paying for a night in a hotel or a bed and breakfast. It's clever.
Yes. No Airbnb in those days. Eh?
No.
Although, would you want an Airbnb in Innsmouth?
Oh, there's a story in that, isn't there?
Yeah, there could be the germ of a new business venture in that, I think, perhaps.
Yeah.
And of course, with this being a sequel, Block responded with another sequel, The Shadow from the Steeple, although that wasn't written until 1950, so quite some time after. I get the impression from reading a little bit about Block that Lovecraft's death hit him pretty hard.
It did, yeah.
And he sort of moved away from doing any Lovecraftian stuff for a little while. So it's nice that he came back round with The Shadow from the Steeple, which we'll talk about a little bit as we get into the story.
Indeed.
And I think the other interesting thing here is that this stage in his career, Lovecraft seemed to be heading more towards a science fiction approach, given that his previous works to this were at the Mountains of Madness and The Shadow Out of Time, both with that sort of deep time, almost science fiction alien element. But this story, which I believe he wrote in a week or something in response to Block, this is back to full on mythos, isn't it?
Oh yeah, he's one of the central stories of the mythos. You know, there's no other way of putting it than that, because yeah, there's so many threads to other bits and pieces and callbacks to other work and all this kind of stuff, because you've got mentions of Yuggoth and all kinds of stuff in there, haven't we?
It's all in here. It's all in. I think Cthulhu's about the only thing that isn't mentioned, actually, isn't it? I can't.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
But then people often forget that Lovecraft called his mythos Yog-Sothory, and Cthulhu was not the major sort of figure, really, was he? Or her?
No. Yeah, it was Derleth that called it the Cthulhu mythos.
Yeah.
But quite rightly, I think, to be honest, because if you think about in terms of visibility and, you know, recognizable, Cthulhu is a great image, isn't it?
Oh, it's iconic, isn't it? Yeah, squid face.
Like a figurehead.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas Yog-Sothoth is a bunch of slimy orbs, you know.
Let's not go there.
No, let's not. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah, and I think the god that's or being that's referenced the most is probably Nyarlathotep, who we'll be talking about in this story. And again, that's the god with 1,000 faces, right? So there's no one clear image.
Yeah.
And what I like with this story is from the very first, we learn that the main protagonist is dead. Cautious investigators will hesitate to challenge the common belief that Robert Blake was killed by lightning. So that's our opening line. So we're from the start point of our main character is dead. So now the mystery, of course, is how did he die and why?
Yeah, profound nervous shock derived from an electrical discharge. And he goes on to explain that the window was unbroken, but nature had shown herself capable of many freakish performances. So you're right. You've got this lovely mystery to set it up, and I think that's one of the real strong points of this story is that mystery.
Yes.
Of like, well, we know it's got something to do with the church on Federal Hill. The guy's dead, you know.
Well, for me, this is like a prime Call of Cthulhu scenario.
Mm-hmm.
It has all the elements of the good COC RPG game. We've got a mysterious death in strange circumstances. We've got an abandoned church. We've got locals. We've got a cult. We've got a dead journalist. We've got a journal with code in it. We've got a mythos artifact. You know, it's got all the components for that investigative approach with a horrible monster at the end of it.
Yeah, it'd make a great one of those narrative first-person horror games.
Yeah,
it'd be a great backdrop for one of those as well. Yeah.
And the other thing I liked in this setup was we learned that Blake is a writer and also an artist of some ability and renown. And I thought what we're seeing here is a sort of combination of Robert Bloch and Clark Ashton Smith as a character.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yeah, there's speculation that this is all a hoax. This is, you know what these writers are like. They'll invent these odd things and then it's all going to be part of his story. It's all publicity and promo. But then we do have these strange facts as well. We know there's a Starry Wisdom cult. We know that a journalist, Edwin Lillibridge, disappeared in 1893. We know that the locals shun this old abandoned church. So perhaps there is a kernel of truth to the speculation that this was a real event.
I like the way, obviously, the name Robert Blake. It's obviously Robert Bloch, and he comes from Milwaukee, like Bloch. and all this, but he came back to Providence in the winter of 1934/35, taking the upper floor of a venerable dwelling in a grassy court off College Street, which is a nice little nod, isn't it?
Well, it's pure biographical from Lovecraft, isn't it?
Indeed.
Because in 1933, I think it was, he and his aunt moved into the upstairs of 66 College Street, where he had a very nice view across Providence and particularly of Federal Hill. So when you get this description here of the writer sat in his study looking out at this panoramic view of Providence, this is Lovecraft.
Indeed. In fact, I have a lovely little bit here from Dawnwood Spire, Lonely Hill, the letters of H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith. And as I'm actually reading this time, I think it's only right that I do the return address. So here we go. The letter is dated the 10th of November, 1935. And the return address is The Cave of the Shining Trapezohedron, Hour of the Purple Glow.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one.
However, it doesn't take much to encourage an old man, so the other day I found myself writing a new story. The Haunter of the Dark is its present title, and I finished it yesterday. Don't know whether it's worth typing, but I'll read it over again. 24 pages of manuscript, may come near 30 of double-spaced typing. Acting on the suggestion of somebody in the Erie, I dedicated it to young Block. I'm killing him off in return for his delightful disposal of Grandpa in The Shambler from the Stars. He left me splattered all over the room, but I leave him in a neater shape, as a body sitting rigidly at a desk and gazing out of west window with an expression of unutterable fear on the twisted features. The scene is in Providence, and the abode of the victim is number 66. Indeed, I've described the place a bit. This tale wouldn't be placeable anywhere save in Weird Tales, perhaps. I'll let Wright see it after he's had a chance to reflect on the fate of mountains. So there we go. Yeah, that was a conscious thing to describe it. And so what we get in there of the descriptions of the place is accurate to Lovecraft's memory kind of thing. So,
yeah, and we can speculate as to whether this view prompted the story, or did the idea from Block prompt it, and then he looked at the view and thought, I can use that, which came first in the formulation of the story. Perhaps he had this idea floating around for a little bit, because he did write it very quickly, it seems. And I can imagine him sitting there and he's looking out over Federal Hill, and there's this huge church sticking up on the horizon in the middle of Federal Hill. The actual church was St. John's Catholic Church. That was built in 1873. And unfortunately, it was demolished in 1992. We can only speculate as to why that might have been.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does remind me of when I was growing up, because out of the window from where my first house, it was St. Paul's Church, which was a lovely old Gothic. It was one of those Gothic spires that poked out above the trees in Macclesfield. And on dark, stormy nights, there was something incredibly sinister about it. When you've got like this, that sort of hazy street light thing, and then this spire pointing out above it all. It was all a bit foreboding and quite sinister. So that's how I picture it in my head. Is like that. Yeah,
I totally get that. And sometimes those distant objects in a little bit of haze and everything else, they take on a different life perhaps, and a different meaning, and it allows your imagination to work, doesn't it?
Yeah, quite recently we went out to Borley to look at the ruins of Borley Rectory.
Oh, yeah.
And as we were walking from Long Melton across, it was sort of like a sunken thing with a climb up to Borley, and you could see the church on the horizon. and yeah, there was clouds around it. And it was just like, ooh, yeah, I'm feeling it now.
Nice. It is a strange place there. I found myself there by accident once, but that's another story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Federal Hill was an area that in Lovecraft's time had largely been settled by Italian and Irish immigrants. And the original name, which I'm sure I'm going to murder the pronunciation of this, was Nokkabulabet, or something along those lines, which is believed to be Narragansett for land between the ancient waters, which in itself I thought was quite a Lovecraftian name, isn't it?
Isn't it? I like that. That's nice. There's something quite Clark Ashton Smith about that, quite poetic.
Yeah, the ancient waters. Yeah.
Yeah.
And College Street itself, which I think we did walk down, the actual house was moved to Prospect Street. You know, people move home. In some places, they move the actual house.
That's a common thing in Australia. They have them like low-bedded trucks that come along and pick your house up and take it 3 miles down the road.
They just move it somewhere else. Yeah, yeah. I guess the same in the States because they're usually, well, the New England is that typical wooden house, and it's not like digging out foundations and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's literally sort of on the edge of the Brown University grounds and just around the corner to the John Hay Library as well, which is a very interesting place if you ever get the chance to go there. So, yeah, we get all this description of the study, and now we often talk about Derlethian shopping lists, right?
Indeed.
Particularly of books. Well, we get 2 in this. We get 2 for the price of 1. And we start off with, I guess, what we'd call they're fictional fiction books, aren't they?
Indeed, yeah. I like this bit. It's Blake's arranged his books, and it goes through some of Blake's works. So, and I've done a little bit of digging about this because there seems to be that a lot of them are inspired by stories that Block wrote. So, The Stairs in the Crypt is believed to be the story The Grinning Ghoul. The Feaster from the Stars is The Shambler from the Stars. There we go. And The Burrower Beneath is believed to be a story that Block wrote called The Blasphemy Beneath. But unfortunately, that's a lost story. It's not believed to have survived.
Oh, wow. Oh, I never knew there was a lost story with Block there.
Yeah, apparently so. And but Lovecraft had read all these because Block would send them to him.
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
So these stories, we've got the list here is The Burrower Beneath, The Stairs in the Crypt, Shagai, In the Vale of Panath, and The Feaster from the Stars. There we go. So they're all believed to be inspired by Block stories in one way or another.
Nice. And this is that sort of fiction within fiction, isn't it? Aspect of
yeah, it's metafiction, isn't it? It's
yeah. And then of course you throw the real book in there, as we'll see in the second shopping list, just to give it that air of verisimilitude.
Nice, yeah.
So Blake gets fascinated by this view and this church in particular. And one thing he notices after sort of prolonged observation is how the flocks of birds in the area seem to avoid the steeple of the church. He finds this quite strange. And very early on in this, we get a sense of him being attracted to the church. You think he's being drawn in. It's almost like we know that there's something in the steeple. Is that sort of actively scoping for someone to latch onto, I wonder, you know?
That's kind of how I took it, yeah, because it's that sort of inexorable pull, isn't it, that he has. Because he gets some lovely descriptions here about like the floodlights and all this kind of lighting it and something drawing his eye constantly to the steeple.
And it describes how this goes on over a period of time. As months passed, Blake watched the far-off forbidding structure with an oddly mounting interest. Since the vast windows were never lighted, he knew that it must be vacant. The longer he watched, the more his imagination worked, till at length he began to fancy curious things. He believed that a vague, singular aura of desolation hovered over the place, so that even the pigeons and swallows shunned its smoky eaves. Around other towers and belfries, his glass would reveal great flocks of birds, but here they never rested. So I suppose given the fact that he's a weird fiction writer, that sort of thing would grab his attention. And this is how your imagination works, right? When you're a writer, you see something a little bit odd and think, oh, I wonder if night gaunts live in that tree.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We've discussed it before, haven't we? Because we both had a similar thing where you're sitting there and then all the birds just suddenly get out of a tree, just go woof. And you're like, what do they know? Is there a ghoul? You know?
Yeah, my cat is staring into space again. Is there some sort of space vampire hovering outside?
Yeah, exactly.
Or is it just being a cat?
Or is it just being a cat? Yeah.
So then we get our first date, which is April the 30th, to be precise, otherwise known as Walpurgis Nacht or Walpurgis Night.
Mm.
So the symbolism here, or the meaning here, is, well, Walpurgis Night is a Christian feast day, a saint day, to Saint Walpurga, who was known as someone who fought against witchcraft. And there's speculation, of course, that this being May Day, this Saint's Day was overlaid on earlier so-called pagan festivals. And it is said that on this night, evil is at its strongest. So I guess they pray to Saint Walpurga to protect themselves from evil spirits. Bonfires are lit, that kind of thing, which of course plays into this story in a major way as well.
Indeed, I thought there was a nice parallel there to one of Nyarlathotep's previous appearances in Lovecraft's work, obviously Dreams in the Witch House, because you think they're the witches and all that kind of stuff, because he was described as the shadowy man of the witch cult.
Yes.
Was it?
Yeah. And in Bavaria, Walpurgis Nacht is known as, which is a great band name, Hexennacht.
There is a band called Hexennacht.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, there is. I think they're sort of like death metal or something.
I can hear them.
Yeah.
I can hear them already. I can see the logo. I can hear. Oh, and Hexen, by the way, is a great film. If no one has ever seen that, is that 1920s? I think.
Yeah.
German Impressionism, silent film, Hexen. Yeah, well worth watching if you can see it. It was probably up on YouTube, I think.
And also two very, very good video games, Hexen and Hexen 2, from Raven Software in the 90s. They were first-person shooters, and they were really good.
So he chooses Walpurgis Nacht for some reason, known only to himself. Or again, perhaps this is the influence of the Haunter working. And he sets off to find the church, and he has some trouble finding it. Now and then a battered church facade or crumbling spire came in sight, but never the blackened pile that he sought. When he asked the shopkeeper about a great stone church, the man smiled and shook his head, though he spoke English freely. As Blake climbed higher, the region seemed stranger and stranger, with bewildering mazes of brooding brown alleys leading eternally off to the south. So you get this sense of the liminal space, don't you? It's gone into this hill.
Yeah.
And this is pure Lovecraft as well, isn't it? Crumbling old towns with strange little twisting alleyways. And every now and again you catch a glimpse of something, but you can't quite find it. It's almost that dreamland landscape again.
Yeah, it does remind me actually of the beginning of Dreams in the Witch House, because you have a similar thing of the guy going through Arkham, don't you, to try and find this lodgings.
Yes.
And it's almost like he's stepped into another universe. Yeah, I love this bit here, because you know that thing when you're looking for something like the Albert Hall is a great example. You're looking for it, and you're going down all these little rabbit warrens of streets, and then you come around the corner and bang, it's just suddenly there in front of you.
Yeah.
And you get exactly this here. Then suddenly a black spire stood out against the cloudy sky on his left. Above the tiers of brown roofs lining the tangled southerly alleys, Blake knew at once what it was and plunged towards it through the squalid, unpaved lanes that climbed from the avenue. You've also got this lovely feeling of neglect and decay, haven't you?
Yes.
That we talk about a lot on Strange Shadows of what Clark Ashton Smith does with his. We'll start off in isn't this a nice, pretty vale? And then all of a sudden, tangled, diseased trees, you know?
Strange fungal growth.
Indeed.
And all that kind of.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, I think we've said before, Smith generally expresses that in botanical terms. It's usually the flora and fauna. Mm-hmm. With Lovecraft, it's architectural. It's the rotting gambrel roofs and the dirty, dusty windows and all that sort of stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Because you get a lot of that in this, talking about grime-encrusted windows and greasy cobbles. And,
sooty Gothic windows, stone mullions.
Nice. Nice.
And it stands in the middle of this square, the church, and no one seems to be around or be around it. And again, you wonder now what came first, the decay or the church. Is the fact that this thing lives there. It's almost like the canker in the heart of the neighbourhood. Its baleful influence spreads out and is slowly decaying everything it touches.
Yeah, I think maybe, that malign influence sort of, creeping out into everything around it. It's that's something he does a lot, isn't it? And always does incredibly well.
Now, one of the few people that Blake does see is a policeman at the northerly end of the square. So he approaches the copper and has a chat with him. It turns out this is an Irish fella. And basically the story is that no one talks about the church. No one wants to go near it. Something horrible happened there, possibly, and they try to exorcise the place. There'd been an outlaw sect there in the old days that called up awful things from some unknown gulf of night. And even though the place has been exorcised, people still won't go near it. And that's pretty much it. And again, this is the typical from M.R. James onwards, isn't it? Where the locals know what's happening.
Yeah.
Warning to the curious, but no, you're going to ignore all that. And of course, you're going to go and have a look.
Yeah, it's no digging here, isn't it? It's what I like is that I like there's quite a subtle thing that they all do a little hand. You know, it's that warding off evil thing.
The evil eye thing, yeah.
We've talked about that before. Neither of us can do it, can we? Yeah, but anybody he mentions the church to or asks where it is or whatever, they all do this little thing. So yeah.
Which I suppose is only going to pique his interest even more, being the kind of person that he is.
Like you would me.
Yeah.
If people start acting squirrely about something, if I ask them about it, I'm like, ooh, must be well
there
worth
must be
checking
something
out.
interesting going on.
Yeah.
And here we get, one of our favourite mythos words. The sheer bulk of the church was oppressive now that he was close to it, but he conquered his mood and approached to try the 3 great doors in the facade. All were securely locked, so he began a circuit of the Cyclopean building in a quest of some minor or more penetrable opening. And we get this sort of stressed again. Even then, he could not be sure that he wished to enter that haunt of desertion and shadow, yet the pull of its strangeness dragged him on automatically. So again, very much this sense that he's being drawn into it.
Yeah, well, he's almost in a somnambulistic state, isn't he? It's like he doesn't know why he's drawn to it or where he's going. He just knows he's going to this church. And it's very interesting. It's almost like just staring at the steeple. Nyarlathotep's got his claws in him, kind of thing.
Yes, he's got him on the hook. He's on the hook now.
Yeah.
We get into this is real like Urbex territory now, isn't it? Because he finds a broken cellar window and he crawls in. It's all dust and cobwebs and everything else, and a sense of oppression.
Mm.
And I like this. This guy is thinking Blake is definitely an investigator, because he climbs in through the window and he sort of drops to the floor some little distance below. Before he does any more, he finds a barrel and he rolls that over to the window so he can make a quick exit should he need to.
Well, that was a nice touch because, I mean, okay, you would have thought about that before you went in, or at least I would. Like, is there some way I can get back out of here once I'm in there?
Yeah. Well, I'm playing a new RPG campaign at the moment, Rollmaster, so it's like a fantasy setting, and all these things are coming back. Like, if you're in a room and there's 2 doors, you never open them both at the same time, and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, yes.
It's basic adventuring. So yeah, that was fun to see that.
Yeah.
And he makes his way up into the main body of the church, and we get some very nice description here. The colossal nave was an almost eldritch place with its drifts and mountains of dust over box pews, altar, hourglass pulpit, and sounding board, and its titanic ropes of cobweb stretching among the pointed arches of the gallery and entwining the clustered Gothic columns. Over all this hushed desolation played a hideous leaden light as the declining afternoon sun sent its rays through the strange, half-blackened panes of the great apsidal windows. I like that word, the declining sun. There's an implication there, isn't there?
There is, isn't there? It's so much more sinister than saying like sinking or
the setting sun, the sinking sun. Yeah,
setting. Yeah, declining. Yeah, and the leaden light. That's another lovely little phrase.
And of course, the designs on the window, on the stained glass window, are not the conventional Christian ones that you might expect to find in a Catholic church.
No.
And he also notices that the cobwebbed cross above the altar is not actually a cross, it's an ankh. So there's our first hint of Egypt.
Indeed.
And we all know who lived in Egypt, don't we?
Indeed. As soon as you mention Egypt in a Lovecraftian setting, you know what's coming, don't you? It's, yeah.
And this is where we get our second shopping list, because he starts exploring around in the rear vestry room. Here, for the first time, he received a positive shock of objective horror, for the titles of those books told him much. And now, as he says, most people wouldn't know what these books were, but he's obviously a connoisseur of the occult. He's a weird fiction writer. So he knows, he understands the implication behind these books. A Latin version of the Abhorred Necronomicon, the sinister Liber Ivonis, the infamous Conte des Ghouls of the Comte d'Erlet, the Unaussprechlichen Kulten of von Juntz, and old Ludwig Prinz Hellish, the Vermis Mysterious. But there were others he had known merely by reputation. The narcotic manuscripts, the Book of Dzyan, and a crumbling volume of wholly unidentifiable characters, yet with certain symbols and diagrams shudderingly recognizable to the occult student. So that's a fair old spread there, isn't it?
And I like it because it's yet more nods, isn't it? Because obviously the whole story is a nod to Robert Bloch, but through this we have the Comte d'Erlet, which is August Derleth, von Junst, which is Robert E. Howard, and of course Ludwig Prinz Hellish de Vermis Mysteries, that's Robert Bloch's creation. So there we go. It's a nice little nods to the circle.
Yes, totally. And of course, as we mentioned before, you've got these fictional, factual tomes, but then there's a real one slipped in there as well. And that's the Book of Dzyan, or more properly, the stanzas of Dzyan. So this is from Blavatsky, from a 2-volume The Secret Doctrine, which contains a translation of the stanzas and select translations from the traditional commentaries on them. Blavatsky describes the book as an archaic manuscript, a collection of palm leaves made impermeable to water, fire, and air by some specific unknown process, written in a language known as Senzar, which ultimately derives from the inhabitants of lost Atlantis.
Nice.
There we go.
Yeah, interestingly, because I'm actually got a couple of the Chaosium Call of Cthulhu fiction books here in front of me because I'm using it for reference. I've got the Nyarlathotep Cycle and Mysteries of the Worm, which is the Robert Bloch collection. But they actually published a version of the Book of Dzyan.
Oh, right.
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon. Yeah.
Of course you can.
I know, it's hilarious, isn't it? Go on Amazon and get the Book of Dzyan. Yeah, so there we go. I keep meaning to do it just out of interest, but there we go.
Funnily enough, I was up the West End of London last week, and I went into Forbidden Planet, and they've got, I think, 4 versions of the Necronomicon now. Well, I say 4 versions. This is, the Simon Necronomicon, which I think came out. Was that 80s that came out?
Yeah, it was early 80s, I think. Late 70s, early 80s. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's another 3 of those now by the same author, or certainly it says by Simon, whoever Simon is.
Yeah.
And it's Spells of the Necronomicon and History of the Necronomicon, and I can't remember the other one. I mean, to be honest, I picked them up, flicked through and put them back down again because,
Yeah.
It's you like Lovecraft, buy these books. It's one of those, I think.
Yeah, it's one of those things I read. I did read the Simon Necronomicon many, many moons ago, and it was completely sort of, what's the word? What's a polite way of putting it? Underwhelmed. There we go.
Underwhelmed. Yeah. It's not really anything to do with anything, is it?
No, it's like a lot of those things. Because I remember there was a Forbidden Planet in Wolverhampton when I lived there in the sort of late 90s, and there was a bit in there, like just one shelf, and it was the Simon Necronomicon, the Satanic Bible, all these.
Oh yeah,
the book sort of thing, right?
I think I got my Satanic Bible in Forbidden Planet actually.
Yeah.
Many years back. Again, I found that a bit underwhelming, to be honest.
So did I. Yeah.
But LaVey was, a showman. Good showman.
Very much so. Very much so.
And I wonder, we do talk about the Derlethian shopping list, which in every Derleth mythos story, this list appears. I wonder if this is where he got it from. I mean, Lovecraft has done this before.
He has, yeah.
I guess as he goes through, he does tend to. You don't just find the Necronomicon. There's always these other books with them as well, it seems.
Yeah, I think so, but I think the problem with the Derleth one is that he just takes it to extremes. Whereas Lovecraft's mentioned 4 or 5. If that was Derleth, that'd be an entire page. I think that, and he'd also slip in a bunch of his Arkham House books as well. Which I get why he did it, but it just seems a bit excessive.
Yeah, gratuitous, isn't it?
That's the word.
It does feel, it's like or box ticking almost,
It's a bit like product placement in a way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose it is. Yeah. Now, as well as these unholy eldritch tomes, he finds in a ruined desk a small leather-bound record book filled with entries in some odd cryptographic medium. So we're straight into that COC adventure again. It's got a code to break as well. And perhaps some library work in order to do his research, which is exactly what happens.
Indeed.
But before that, he finds something even more disturbing. Having now thoroughly explored the ground floor, Blake ploughed again through the dust of the spectral nave to the front vestibule, where he had seen a door and staircase. The ascent was a choking experience, for dust lay thick while the spiders had done their worst in this constricted place. The staircase was a spiral with high, narrow wooden treads, and now and then Blake passed a clouded window looking dizzily out over the city. So he finds himself at the top of the tower, basically in a small room about 15 feet square, faintly lighted by 4 lancet windows. And these windows have got opaque screens over them, but they've rotted away. So this is what has let the light in. There's a pillar in the centre of this room. On the pillar rested a metal box of peculiarly asymmetrical form, its hinge lid thrown back, and its interior holding what looked beneath the decade-deep dust to be an egg-shaped or irregularly spherical object some 4 inches through. And this, of course, is the polyhedral stone. Polyhedral always makes me think of dice in D&D. And this is going to be the source of all the trouble.
Yeah, the old shining trapezohedron. Yeah, which interestingly, every year, I think it's yearly, isn't it? Necronomicon in Providence. I know it used to be. I don't know whether it's gone back to being yearly post-pandemic, but they have their awards, and one of their awards is the Robert Bloch Award. And quite fittingly, the trophy that winners of this esteemed award get is a shining trapezohedron. So there we go. It's a nice touch, yeah.
And a nice thing about this jewel, this gem, or whatever you want to call it, is it sort of floats in the box, or well, it's suspended by means of a metal band around its centre, with 7 queerly designed supports extending horizontally to angles of the box's inner wall near the top. The number 7 crops up a lot during this as well, right?
It does.
And is totally fascinated by this, what he describes as an alarming fascination. And as he looks at it, he almost fancied it was transparent, with half-formed worlds of wonder within. Into his mind floated pictures of alien orbs with great stone towers, and other orbs with titan mountains and no mark of life, and still remoter spaces where only a stirring in vague blacknesses told of the presence of consciousness and will. So this put me in mind a little bit of Tolkien's Palantir, the Seeing Stones. Yeah,
you do get sort of it's almost like that catoptromancy thing, the staring into a mirror, the scrying and all that kind of stuff, isn't it? It's that kind of concept. And if that wasn't enough, this is where he gets another bit of a shock to the old system, because when he did look away, it was to notice a somewhat singular mound of dust in the far corner near the ladder to the steeple. Just why it took his attention, he could not tell, but something in its contours carried a message to his unconscious mind. Yeah, so he basically goes over, brushes away the cobwebs, and it was a human skeleton. There's a poor old corpse up there.
Yes, and this we learn because obviously he searches the pockets like you would, wouldn't you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He finds the pocketbook, and, this is the next round of clues, right? And he finds that this is Edwin M. Lillibridge, who was a journalist who went missing in 1893. And this guy was obviously investigating the Starry Wisdom cult because he's got all the newspaper cut-ins, and it's got like a ready-made clue kit on him, isn't he?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Professor Enoch Bowen, home from Egypt. There we go again. May 1844, buys Old Free Will Church in July. His archaeological work and studies in occult are well known. So already it's just like, yeah, well, he was up to no good. Then Dr. Drown of Fourth Baptist warns against starry wisdom in a sermon. Congregation, and then 3 disappearances. First mention of shining trapezohedron. 7 disappearances. Stories of blood sacrifice. Investigation in 1853 comes to nothing. Stories of weird sounds from the steeple. Yeah, and basically it just goes on, doesn't it? All these singular events that once you read this, because there's a lot of things about hearing noises from the steeple and people going missing. You can understand why the people who live near it don't want to talk about it and are in a state of panic. Because since Bowen came back, it's kind of had this really malign influence on the area.
And one other thing he noticed is the strange condition of this skeleton. Blake stooped over the gleaming bones and noted their peculiar state, strangely yellowed with vague suggestions of charring. This charring extended to some of the fragments of clothing. The skull was in a very peculiar state, stained yellow and with a charred aperture in the top, as if some powerful acid had eaten through the solid bone. And I like the way he puts it down to this. What had happened to the skeleton during its 4 decades of silent entombment here, Blake could not imagine. So he thinks this is something that's happened post-mortem rather than actually being the cause of death.
Indeed. Yeah, but before he could get any further, he's drawn back to the stone, isn't it? And this is where he sees more towers and walls in nighted depths under the sea, vortices of space where wisps of black mist floated before thin shimmerings of cold purple haze. Jimi Hendrix time. I'm glad I'm not alone. Every time I read this story, I get that. Purple haze. Yeah. And he makes a bit of an error now, doesn't he? Because he decides, I've got the pocketbook, I've got this guy's notes, I'll take the stone. And he closes the lid.
Yes. And as he does so, he gets a very ominous feeling. He felt entangled with something which was not in the stone, but which had looked through it at him, something which would ceaselessly follow him with a cognition that was not physical sight. And he panics a bit here, does he? And now he basically just runs.
Yeah.
He just flees the place in a bit of a blind panic.
Yeah, and as it does, he in the gathering twilight, he thought he saw a faint trace of luminosity in the crazily angled stone. He had tried to look away from it, but some obscure compulsion drew his eyes back. Was there a subtle phosphorescence of radioactivity about the thing? Yeah, so something bad is happening now. He's made a mistake.
Yes, I love that he gets that ominous sound as well. A soft stirring sound seemed to come from the steeple's eternal blackness overhead beyond the trapdoor, because there's a trapdoor in the ceiling, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, he puts that down to rats.
Yeah, but is this again what we've talked about a lot, especially in Lovecraft's work as opposed to Smith's work, that rationalization that kicks in with these people. These are all rational types. They're not given to flights of fantasy, even though they're fiction writers.
Even though he's a fiction writer.
Yeah.
And it's almost his imagination that has pulled him in the first place, but now perhaps it's like a form of sort of unconscious self-defense.
That's exactly what it is, yeah.
That is denying all this. No, it's just, I'm here. I can use this to write a story. It can't possibly be real.
Absolutely. That's precisely what I take from it, is that it's a coping mechanism, isn't it? It's like, when you end up in a sort of crap situation, say you're stranded because your train's broken down or something like that, right? What's the first thing you do? Oh, it'll be all right.
Yeah, probably. It'll be all right, probably.
Yeah, it'll be all right. You tell. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, don't go on the moors. Yeah.
Let's go on the moors.
Yeah.
So that's it. He returns to College Street, and of course, he still can't resist the old impulse to gaze westwards and look at the black steeple again. And it takes him about a month now. We move into June. By the way, it's an unnamed narrator here. It's quite an interesting way the story is told, because quite often this would be through the protagonist's eyes, but we get this sort of overarching narration throughout. It's almost the impression that someone after Blake has died is going through all his notes and diary and putting down his version of events. So in June, Blake's diary tells of his victory over the cryptogram.
Yep.
The text was, he found, in the dark Aklo language used by certain cults of evil antiquity. And he's got some familiarity of this through his previous researches. And here is where we get our first name, because there is a reference to a haunter of the dark, awaked by gazing into the shining trapezohedron and insane conjectures about the black gulfs of chaos from which it was called. So again, this is where he starts gaining mythos knowledge and starts losing his sanity as a result.
Yeah, he's one sand roll away from the asylum at this point, isn't he? Of the shining trapezohedron he speaks often, calling it a window on all time and space, and tracing its history from the days it was fashioned on dark Yuggoth, before ever the old ones brought it to earth. It was treasured and placed in its curious box by the crinoid things of Antarctica, salvaged from their ruins by the serpent men of Valusia, and peered at eons later in Lemuria by the first human beings. So here we've got I've got a plethora of references here.
I love this, because we start with Yuggoth, which of course is the home of the Migo, the fungi from Yuggoth.
Indeed.
Or, well, not necessarily their origin place, but they've got a colony established there.
It's an outpost, isn't it? Yeah.
So there's speculation, was it the Migo that brought this to Earth? We get the old ones mentioned as well, which of course could refer to many things. Indeed.
And then the crinoid things of Antarctica, that's Mountains of Madness right there.
Yeah.
And then the ruins of the serpent men of Valusia, that's a Robert E. Howard reference.
Well, I love this, because there's often speculation and discussion about this. And to my mind, the discussion is totally unwarranted, because it's quite clear in a few places, this being one of them, that Howard's and Lovecraft's universe are the same.
Mm-hmm.
These are just the same, different timescales. Conan, Cole, etc., all exist in Lovecraft's mythos universe.
Yeah, because that's a cool story, isn't it?
Yes, the serpent men. Yeah. Karnama Kalajarama. That's what you have to say.
Right. Okay. Oh, easy for you to say.
Serpent men. Yeah, serpent men can't say that.
Does that mean I'm a serpent man? I'm not even going to attempt it.
Well, I did notice your eyes are going a bit,
Yeah, right, fair enough. I can live with that. There's worse things to be than a serpent man as well.
And Hissing Tim, I'm going to call you.
Yeah. Hissing Tim. Oh, brilliant.
So yeah, it neatly ties all of those things together in just a few lines, doesn't it? This is the equivalent, Smith's world building we speak about on Strange Shadows, where Smith will take you to an alien planet and give you 2 lines, perhaps. And you've almost got, within those 2 lines, this whole history of the place. It's very clever how it's done, or this sense of history. And Lovecraft does that here again in a few lines. You've suddenly linked all these things together.
Yeah, because he carries on in the same paragraph, talking about that it crossed strange lands, stranger seas, sank with Atlantis, before a Minoan fisher meshed it in his net and sold it to swarthy merchants from Knighted Kem. There we go. So there's another reference. And then we get the pharaoh Neferenkar built around it a temple with a windowless crypt, and did that which caused his name to be stricken from all monuments and records. Yeah.
Now, Neferenkar.
Indeed.
Neferenkar was the last pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty in Lovecraft's works. And it actually first mentioned him in The Outsider in 1926. Mm-hmm. So again, this is a fairly old reference or character for Lovecraft. And Neferenkar was a worshipper of Nyarlathotep, and upon his death became an avatar of Nyarlathotep. And this is where we get that youthful pharaoh figure from.
Indeed.
I think this is that personification of Nyarlathotep.
Yes, and it's what Block himself used in several of his stories. That was this version of Nyarlathotep, like the faceless god, because it's a sphinx to Neferencar, but the face has been removed by people who were like, because his name was stricken from all records. Because what he would do was he would bring people in to this lightless chamber and sacrifice them to the trapezohedron. So it was all very bloody and grim.
And Fane of the Black Pharaoh as well, of course, we have from
Fane of the Black Pharaoh, yeah.
And Lovecraft himself also references Neferencar in Charles Dexter Ward, Rats in the Walls, the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, of course. Now, Nyarlathotep, as we said at the start, was probably the character that Lovecraft referred to the most out of any of his characters. And it was actually the first god, if we can put it that way, that Lovecraft came up with. And there's a lot of speculation that Nyarlathotep originally was influenced by Tesla.
Indeed. Wasn't that a dream he'd had?
Yes. Lovecraft wrote to Right Heart Kleiner on December the 14th, 1920, and told him about a dream in which he received a note from another correspondent, Samuel Loveman, imploring him to catch Nyarlathotep's next lecture. I'd never heard the name Nyarlathotep before, but seemed to understand the allusion. Nyarlathotep was a kind of itinerant showman or lecturer who held forth in public halls and aroused widespread fear and discussion with his exhibitions. These exhibitions consisted of two parts. First, a horrible, possibly prophetic cinema reel, and later some extraordinary experiments with scientific and electrical apparatus. So, of course, that's pretty much word for word what happens in his story, Nyarlathotep, the short story. And that seems very much a Tesla-like figure, doesn't it, at that point?
Yeah, very much so. Because we know that Lovecraft was really into keeping up on science stuff. He read lots of journals and things like that, didn't he? He was fascinated by scientific advancements, so he would have known all about Tesla and what Tesla was up to and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah, Tesla was very big news at the time.
Yeah.
And he does mention Tesla a couple of times in his letters, pretty much only in passing, but it's obvious that he knew of him and his work. And there's quite an interesting couple of facts about Tesla that I found out. First of all, Tesla was, for some reason, acutely sensitive to light. I'll just leave that there.
There we go.
And there's a cat connection as well. We know Lovecraft was a great lover of the feline species.
Indeed.
During his youth in Croatia, Tesla had a cat, the magnificent macaque, the finest of all cats in the world, according to Tesla. I felt impelled to stroke macaque's back, Tesla wrote of that time. What I saw was a miracle that made me speechless. Macaque's back was a sheet of light, and my hand produced a shower of crackling sparks loud enough to be heard all over the place. So this is static, right?
Yeah.
When informed by his father that this was electricity and cautioned by his mother to stop stroking the cat because she feared he'd start a fire, Tesla's mind began racing. Is nature a gigantic cat? Tesla recalled. If so, who strokes its back?
Oh, nice. Nice.
I don't know if Lovecraft had read that or heard about that, but I think he would have wholly approved of nature being a cat with God stroking its back.
Definitely. Yeah, one of the other influences, but believed to be one of the influences for Nyarlathotep, comes from the works of Lord Dunsany, or Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett, to give him his full name. What a name that is. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a chap in tweed, if ever there was one. And it comes from his collection, The Gods of Pagana, which was released in 1905. And we know that Lovecraft was a fan of his work. There's a poem, a very short prose poem called Alhireth-Hotep, the Prophet. I'm just going to read you a little bit this now. When Yug was no more, men said unto Alhireth-Hotep, be thou our prophet, and be as wise as Yug. And Alhireth-Hotep said, I am as wise as Yug. And men were very glad. And Alhireth-Hotep said, of life and death, these be the affairs of Alhireth-Hotep. And men brought gifts to him. So that's the kind of very similar to the Nefren Car, the sacrifice, bringing gifts and all that kind of stuff. But another thing, just want to point out there, that Lovecraft also had Nug and Yeb.
Oh, of course. Yep.
Yeah. So you've got Yug here. There we go.
It's got to have been an influence again, hasn't it? So we then move to early July, and here we get this comment that the newspapers oddly supplement Blake's entries, though in so brief and casual a way that only the diary has called attention to their contribution. Because we get a disturbance at Federal Hill, it seems that since a stranger entered the dreadful church, obviously someone picked him up going in or coming out and spotted him. The locals whisper of unaccustomed stirrings and bumpings and scrapings in the dark windowless steeple, and called on their priests to banish an entity which haunted their dreams. That's quite Call of Cthulhu again, isn't it? When this thing becomes more active, it's not only causing that physical decay in the surrounding area, but it's actually infecting people's dreams as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's something we do associate with old Squidface, isn't it? Is the fact that he's dreaming, dead but dreaming in Relay, and he can manipulate and infect people's minds through their dreams and things like that. And you get that same impression here from old Nyarly, that he's doing the same thing to the locals in the area. They're all being tormented now he's awake. Yes.
And this is something we can talk about at the end with the three-lobe burning eye, this idea of these beings that exist on more than our, three-dimensional level.
Yeah.
They're working on all these different levels. And then on the 17th of July, thing goes from bad to worse because there's a huge thunderstorm in the area and there's a power cut. The city's lighting system is put out of commission for a full hour. And in that black interval, the Italians had nearly gone mad with fright. Those living near the dreaded church had sworn that the thing in the steeple had taken advantage of the street lamp's absence and gone down into the body of the church, flopping and bumping around in a viscous, altogether dreadful way. Flopping, lovely. I mean, flopping, you wouldn't normally think was a creepy or scary word, would you? But in the context of these big unseen monsters, it is very effective.
Especially when you combine it with in a viscous, dreadful way. I mean, that just makes you go, yeah, doesn't it?
Yeah, I have to say with this creature, I know people often say a bat-like shape, but I get the impression of a sort of cross between a slug and a moth somehow. Kind of.
Yeah, I get a bit like one of Chambers's puffy grave worms with wings.
Yeah,
this kind of thing. Yeah,
I think of the wings as being that soft, almost brushy, flappy wings rather than leathery bat wings. So basically, the church is surrounded by people holding lanterns and lights and everything else, and the power eventually comes back on. And a couple of people go into the church to investigate, and they found the dust of the vestibule and a spectral nave ploughed up in a singular way with pits of rotted cushions and satin pew linings scattered curiously around. There was a bad odour everywhere, and here and there were bits of yellow stain and patches of what looked like charring. And they do go upstairs. They're quite brave, these couple of chaps, or these couple of people who go into the church. What disturbed Blake the most, except for the hints of stains and charring, was the final detail that explained the crashing glass.
Yeah.
Every one of the tower's lancet windows was broken, and two of them had been darkened in a crude and hurried way by the stuffing of satin pew linings and cushioned horsehair into the spaces between the slanting louvre boards. And the weird thing I thought with this was more satin fragments and bunches of horsehair lay scattered around the newly swept floor, as if someone had been interrupted in the act of restoring the tower to the absolute blackness of its tightly curtained days. So it's almost like Nyarly's doing a bit of housework.
Yeah, I know.
And then, oh shit, someone's coming. I better go back up into my little chamber.
It's brilliant, isn't it? I love that. They're just like, oh, you just let all the light in here, bankers. To see Nyarly with a broom.
It's that newly swept floor, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, people often talk about the banality of evil. So, they've got to do, even like the worst type of serial killer or assassin has to do the laundry or the dishes. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah, that's very true, isn't it? Yeah. So this, of course, only feeds into Blake's monomania, and he becomes increasingly disturbed. His diary shows a mounting tide of insidious horror and nervous apprehension. And now he's thinking, oh, shit, when is the next power cut going to happen? Because I guess we're back in this day and age, in that time. I mean, even now, we had a blip the other day. Yeah. We had a thunderstorm. I was halfway writing through a huge paragraph of stuff, and a power blipped off for 2 seconds. Thanks.
Oh, no.
Control S. All I say now, anything I do, any editing, anything, every 5 seconds, Control S, Control S, Control S.
Oh, yeah, I did that a while ago. I don't know what had happened. I must have glitched out. I'd forgot to save it for ages, and I'd wrote like half a chapter on something with a load of research in it and all this, and I was happy with it. And then Windows update time.
Oh, I think Bill Gates is an anagram of Nyarlathotep, but I'll just put that out there.
Well, yeah, well, that's it. If Nyarly is anywhere in the modern world, he's going to be lurking on the internet.
I think he is the internet.
Yeah, he is the internet.
That's an avatar.
Yeah. Amazon algorithms, that's definitely something to do with Nyarly.
I know, you can work those out.
Exactly.
And Blake even takes to phoning up the electric light company. And you can imagine the poor person who has to deal with that. Right? Oh, it's that Blake. Oh, you gotta keep the lights on. You gotta, one of those.
What's funny is I thought you said Blakey then for a second.
Blakey.
Phoning up. I'll get you back.
That's for our non-UK listeners, that's On the Buses reference. That was a very, very poor 1970s British comedy.
Indeed.
set on the buses, funnily enough.
Split.
If you want to see like British sitcom at its absolute 70s worst, that's a pretty good place to go, I think.
Indeed. Yeah, it was pretty terrible, but I still enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a certain charm in some aspects, but not in others, maybe.
And it was all about Blakey,
yes.
who was played by Stephen Lewis. So there you go.
And then, of course, the worst happens. The week following the 30th of July is recorded as the time of Blake's partial breakdown. He's not going out now. He's ordering all his food by telephone. So that's an early example of having your food delivered, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he's even tying himself up at night because he's afraid of sleepwalking. He's actually found himself in the church or near the church, waking up near it. So he's going through this somnambulism as well.
Yeah.
Again, that feeling of being drawn to the place. Once his groping hands encountered a pillar of stone with a vacant top, whilst later he found himself clutching the rungs of a ladder built into the wall and fumbling his uncertain way upwards to some region of intense stench where a hot searing blast beat down against him. He thought of the ancient legends of ultimate chaos, at whose centre sprawls the blind idiot god Azathoth, lord of all things, encircled by his flopping horde of mindless and amorphous dancers, and lulled by the thin, monotonous piping of demoniac flute held in nameless paws. So he really is chucking everything into this one, isn't he?
Yeah, that's it. It is one of the most mythos-y stories that he ever did, isn't it? It's like a mythos greatest hits in a way, which is probably a reason I absolutely love it. So yeah, following that bait of sleepwalking is actually securing himself in at night. And then on the 8th of August, we get the finale, the denouement. We get a great storm just before midnight. Lightning struck repeatedly in all parts of the city, and 2 remarkable fireballs are reported. The rain was torrential, while a constant fusillade of thunder brought sleeplessness to thousands. And Blake's phoning the electric company again, though it sounds like they're not answering or no one's picking the phone up. But it is 1 a.m. in the morning. Yeah, and he starts scribbling in his diary then, doesn't he? Detached phrases such as, "The lights must not go. It knows where I am. I must destroy it. It is calling to me. But perhaps it means no injury this time." So I think that's a nice little touch wood. What does it want?
Yeah, that's quite ominous, isn't it, in a way?
It is,
yeah.
Especially as we know that it subsumed the consciousness of Neferencar.
Yes.
And, you know, with the hindsight of the knowledge we know, like the mythos knowledge that we know, that it can subsume people and take them over and turn them into avatars. Maybe that's what it wants to do to poor old Blakey here.
Well, indeed, and we'll come to that when we talk about the shadow from the steeple as well, right?
Indeed.
Because that's, we see how that progresses. Exactly that, yeah. 2:12 a.m., the lights go out. The power's cut. The entry in Blake's diary is merely lights out. God help me. On Federal Hill, they're all out. They're surrounding the church. They've got their candles, flashlights, oil lanterns. They blessed each flash of lightning and made cryptical signs of fear with their right hands when a turn in the storm called the flashes to lessen and finally to cease altogether. And this is where we get that other sort of backup to Blake's, what some might say, crazed meanderings or his hoax that he's building up, because there's a few reliable witnesses, such as the priest and the policeman, a couple of others, who actually see and experience something seems to burst out of the steeple and flies above them. The thing itself was really quite simple and covered less than 3 minutes of actual time. It started with a definite swelling of the dull fumbling sounds inside the Black Tower. There had for some time been the vague exhalation of strange evil odours, and this had now become emphatic and offensive. Then at last there was a sound of splintering wood, and a large heavy object crashed down in the yard beneath the frowning easterly facade. The tower was invisible now, but as the object neared the ground, the people knew that it was the smoke-grimed Louvre boarding of that tower's east window. So then they get this sense of the air vibrating, which I thought was great, as if with the flapping of wings, and a sudden east-blowing wind more violent than any previous blast, which snatches off the hats and wrench the dripping umbrellas of the crowd. That's a nice touch,
isn't it? See, this is one of those that, like, very visual. You know, I'd love to go back in time and persuade Hammer Films to do this. Because that is so Hammer horror, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So that's pretty much it. There's a huge, sharp flash of lightning, an ear-splitting crash of sound. Half an hour later, the rain stops. The streetlights come back on again. Everyone can go back to bed. And, you know, this gets a little bit of news in the next day's papers. It seems this big lightning flash was even more tremendous further east, where a burst of the singular phaetor was likewise noticed. And it was most marked over College Hill, where the crash awakened all inhabitants and led to a bewildered round of speculations. And then this is very nice, well, nice in a grim way. This is how Blake is discovered. I thought this was very clever.
Yes.
Students in the Psi Delta house, whose upper rear windows looked into Blake's study, noticed the blurred white face at the westward window on the morning of the 9th. They don't think much of it, you know, the guy's sitting there looking out of his window. But when they come back home that evening, he's still sitting there looking out of his window.
I love it. I can't remember the name of the story, but it's an Arthur Machen story. It might be The White Powder. It's one of them anyway. And it's some bloke walking through this suburb, and there's a face at one of the windows. And he turns away and he turns back and the face is still there. And it just does something about that passage. It's one of Macken's creepiest moments. I'll have to dig it out. I'll have to figure out which story it is, but I love that. And it's the same thing. It's like, you know yourself. You get it with cats. Cats do it to me all the damn time. You're walking down the street and you see these two eyes staring at you from behind the curtains. It's like,
yeah. I think what's odd about it as well is we've all done a bit of peeking in our time, right? Something happening outside and you peek out around a curtain. But if someone looks at you, you feel like you have to duck back.
Yes. Yeah.
The weird thing is to stand there and keep staring at them. It's not the done thing, is it really?
No. Again, you get it in a lot of horror movies, especially the old horror movies of the 60s and stuff like that. That cadaverous old cove up in the attic window, staring down at the village, sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Or when they come to the strange mansion that they've just inherited or whatever, there's
Indeed,
perhaps a glimpse of a face somewhere. Yeah, always very effective. So they eventually call the police in, and the door is forced, and they find poor old Blake sat at his desk with this look of frozen terror on his face, his pencil in his hand because he was writing in his journal up until the last. And we get a mention here because, as it said, this provoked some discussion. Is this a hoax? Was this the real thing? The case of these imaginative theorists had not been helped by the action of superstitious Dr. Dexter, who threw the curious box and angled stone into the deepest channel of Narragansett Bay. Now, we're going to speak about that in a little bit.
Indeed.
But I thought a superstitious doctor was an interesting character.
Indeed, yeah.
And of course, people go through his jottings. Some consider them crazed, the ramblings of a madman. And we get this final running commentary, which we'll read a couple of extracts from. Lights still out. Must be 5 minutes now. Everything depends on lightning. Yadith grant it will keep up. Some influence seems beating through it. Rain and thunder and wind deafen. The thing is taking hold of my mind. And then we get that confirmation of what the Haunter actually is.
Yeah.
What am I afraid of? Is it not an avatar of Nyarlathotep, who in antique and shadowy Kem even took the form of man? I remember Yuggoth, the more distant Shagai, and the ultimate void of the black planets. So this is now, to me, like is sharing memories with the thing. Is seeing through his eyes.
Well, you got that through the trapezohedron, didn't you? That he was seeing these vistas and these memories of Nyarlathotep that maybe. Just need to draw your attention to another musical reference here. Ultimate Void of the Black Planets. Now I have the Sisters of Mercy stuck in my head. Black Planet being one of their early singles.
Of course. And we get a feeling here that he's losing his identity, he's becoming subsumed in Nyarlathotep or in the Haunter. My name is Blake, Robert Harrison Blake of 620 East Knapp Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I am on this planet, which is quite a thing, isn't it? It's one thing to lose your identity, but to be on another planet or from another planet is quite wide. And now there's another interesting reference. Sense of distance gone, far is near and near is far. We're in non-Euclidean territory now.
Yeah.
No light, no glass. See that steeple, that tower, window, can hear. Roderick Usher, am mad or going mad. So we'll come back to the Poe reference in a bit.
Indeed, yeah.
And then, of course, I think this is probably one of the most famous endings in Lovecraft, or the famous few lines. I am Robert Blake, but I see the tower in the dark. There is a monstrous odour, senses transfigured. Boarding at the window, cracking and giving way. Yug. I see it coming here. Hellwind, Titan blur, black wings. Yog-Sothoth save me.
The three-lobed burning eye.
Love it. Absolutely love it.
What a great ending to a story that is. And as much as we can think, yeah, it is one of those, it's a little bit, is sitting there writing all this, is he? Yeah. It works. I mean, despite that, I still think it works.
Well, yeah, it's not quite as bad as, is it,
... So there's quite a lot to pick out there. I mean, shall we talk about the Poe thing first? Roderick Usher.
Yeah, from the House of Usher. There we go. Yeah.
Poe was obviously a huge influence on Lovecraft. My thinking of this was in The Fall of the House of Usher. The house was a character. I mean, Usher himself, or Roderick, thought that the house was alive.
Yes.
It had sentience. And of course, it finishes with a big storm as well, I believe, as his sister comes back from the dead.
Indeed, yeah.
So in that sense, I thought that the church, in effect, is like the house, and the character of the church is the Haunter, and, the two are drawn together in this way under the influence of the storm.
Yeah, definitely. And I like the fact that basically as he's writing, it's almost like he's seeing through the eyes of the Haunter. So that's where you get this whole, he's being subsumed. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
And then you have that sort of ambiguity. Did the lightning save him? Did a flash of lightning dispel it? Or was he taken over by it? Or blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, well, this is the other speculation I see. A lot of people seem to think that the haunter is outside his window. It's pretty much taken over his mind. And then it gets struck by lightning, which kills it or destroys it. So that is what kills Blake. Because he's not physically touched, is he? The window isn't broken.
No.
It looks like maybe he's had some sort of electric shock or something, but, it's obviously not a conventional thing. So if the controlling mind dies, then the host body dies with it, so to speak, perhaps.
Yeah. It's almost like that whole thing of don't wake up a sleepwalker as well, kind of thing, because you can send them into shock.
Yeah, or if you die in your sleep, if you die in your dreams, do you die in your
like Freddy Krueger? Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about the three-lobed burning eye as well, because that's a very memorable phrase. It has been used for a number of things, I think, from band names to magazines. I think there's three-lobed eye productions and various things going around.
Yes.
Some see this, or I think some people have used this as a symbol of Nyarlathotep, 3 circles with the flame, a symbol of chaos. Another site I found had a more scientific view on things, and it talked about the electromagnetic spectrum. What is visible to us on that spectrum is, as you might guess, a very minute part of it, what we call light, with our prism, our colours. So if something has a 3-lobed eye, presumably that means it can see a much wider range on the electromagnetic spectrum. So it has a much greater awareness. And that's where I think we come back to that earlier thing of this, the haunter is affecting not only the physical surroundings, but it's operating on a psychic level or a spiritual level or a dream level, because it can see and it can exist in all those different planes or levels as well.
Yeah, this is something that we see a lot with this mythos creations. They exist in a higher plane of consciousness than we do. We're the tiny, insignificant ants that can only see a very limited part of the world around them. And that's like the whole basis of From Beyond, isn't it? Using the resonator to see these higher dimensions. But the problem is, once you see those higher dimensions, the things in those higher dimensions can come and suck your brain out. This is the whole conceit of this world, this carnivorous cosmos that we're in. That's the whole thing. Yeah.
And that's where we get into the ignorance is bliss, basically, isn't it?
Indeed.
Because as much as we have that thing, we were talking on Strange Shadows just recently about the Nameless Offspring, which quotes the Necronomicon, and about the things that lurk between the upturned stone. But in another sense, we are the things beneath the upturned stone, because we live in this cozy little dark place. And if something lifts it up and looks at us, put the stone back.
Yeah. Well, it's a Lovecraft's quote, isn't it? We live on placid islands of ignorance, and it's not safe to venture far.
Yes. Yeah.
From Call of Cthulhu. So, yeah.
Which again really ties back into that M.R. James warning to the curious, and there's things you don't really need to know, and you don't really want to go looking for them. Yeah,
it all comes back to no digging here, doesn't it?
Yeah. You might think you've got this supremely rational mind and everything else, but even if we think on a scientific basis, what's the sum of our knowledge? 2%. I mean,
yeah.
So even on a scientific level, you can't understand what we can't understand. It starts boggling your mind, even just to think about how far away the sun is, or how small our solar system is in relation to the galaxy.
How deep the trenches are, just even staying on our planet.
Yeah.
When you think about the teeming with unknown life in these dark abysses, when you start thinking about that, it's all like, ooh.
Yes, that's why I stay in and watch Netflix and never go out and have my food delivered and have a permanent generator on standby.
Never venture far from the front door. Yeah.
Well, my first name is Robert as well, so
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, could be a thing, couldn't it?
Yeah.
So, Haunter of the Dark, a very influential story. There's been, as we said, a lot of spin-offs. The most direct one was Block himself in 1950, who brought back that character we mentioned earlier, Dr. Dexter. Now, I don't want to say really what happens in that story. I don't want to spoil it, but I think it's safe to say that Block goes full Nyarlathotep.
Oh yeah,
World War Three.
it's a great story. I think we maybe should cover the two stories. Obviously, the first one, the Shambler, and then the Shadow, because that'll make a nice little mini series. Because they're both tremendous stories. Some of Block's best mythos work, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I'm just a big fan of all of his Nyarlathotep stories. I think, aside from Lovecraft, I think he did Nyarlathotep the best.
Yes.
I mean, like The Faceless God is still one of the most harrowing stories. That pursuit across the desert, when we covered it, it's not pleasant, is it?
No, it's that implacable thing that just follows without any emotion, isn't it, or anything else? But it's just relentless in its pursuit of him, which I suppose is the case in this as well. It's a haunter, but it's also a hunter, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
And we can also speculate, we mentioned the Danzani influence there. There's one other story that possibly influenced Lovecraft in writing this, and that was written in 1915 by Heinz Ewers, and it's a story called The Spider. And I think we'll probably cover it at some time because it's a very excellent, gruesome, weird tale. So again, I'm not going to go into specifics here too much, but the pertinent aspect from our point of view is the main character in that is sitting in a window and he's looking out of his sort of tenement and he sees a woman sitting in the window opposite, a woman called Clarimonde, who wears it's a black dress with purple spots. And I'm not going to say any more than that.
I've never read it. I'm going to have to go and read that. My interest has been piqued, Mr. Poynton. I'm going to have to track down a copy of that somehow. Yeah,
it is a cracker. It is a cracker. And again, we can see that idea of seeing something from your window and being pulled in and fascinated by it to your great detriment. I think we'll put it like that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, so like you say, there's been a lot of writing influenced by The Haunter of the Dark. I mean, I've gone down that route, with my novella Spiffing and also my novella Boiling Shadow. They're both sort of takes on that, but given a some Mendy's British chaps in tweed twist. But there's also been a few film adaptations. I just want to briefly get through here. There was a trilogy of no-budget movies from Russia called The Haunter of the Dark. There's Haunter of the Dark, Haunter of the Dark 2, and Haunter of the Dark 3. The first one bears very little resemblance to the story and centers around a chap who goes to an abandoned asylum to film for his blog. And there's The Haunter. It's a found footage movie, very much a riff on Grave Encounters, if anybody's ever seen that. Unfortunately, I can't actually track that. I've managed to track it down, so I can't tell you whether it's any good or not. The second one's about a man who has nightmares about Providensk, which is a nice little touch, and visits the city to find answers. Once there's a bunch of murders and all that kind of stuff. There's a serial killer and a bat-like creature flying through the night. So yeah, that's more like The Haunter of the Dark that we know. Now, the third I know very, very little about, as the IMDb thing is somewhat sparse and has obviously been done by Google Translate. I'm gonna read you the entire entry here. This is all I know about this film, Haunter of the Dark 3. Lead character has bad sleep when Illuminati and a bad monster invasions in little village.
Well, after hearing that, I want to watch that film.
Yeah, I know.
That's one of the best bits of copy I've heard for a long time.
Yeah, it just made me laugh. So yeah, I'm going to try and track down these movies, but I haven't actually been able to at the time of recording. One I have managed to track down, and I actually thoroughly enjoyed it. I watched it the other night. Is Pickman's Muse. As you would imagine from the title, the name Blake, he's been changed. He's now Pickman, right? So they've taken that, but it is pretty much quite a faithful adaptation. He's a painter, and he takes up residence in this house on College Street, and he's painting the spire, and he's drawn to it.
Right.
And the spire becomes his muse, and he becomes fascinated by it. And at the same time, there's some murders and disappearances and all that kind of stuff that's hinted at in the notes of the journalist. And he pretty much follows the beats of the story. There is some differences, and there is some elements of Pickman's model in there, but it's a pretty good movie. It's well worth a watch. It's only about an hour and 10 minutes long, and it came out in 2010. It was a low budget affair, starring a bunch of American TV actors that mostly did like the cop shows and things like that. But it's quite competent. It's worth a thing. It was actually played at the Lovecraft Film Festival.
Oh, okay.
And I believe it had a DVD release through that as well. There.
You mentioned Illuminati there in that wonderful plot, Tracy.
Indeed.
Blake and the Haunter of the Dark are mentioned in the Illuminatus trilogy by Shea and Robert Anton Wilson. Of course, Lovecraft is a character in that. I would love to cover that trilogy at some time, but that's a huge amount of work. That would almost justify its own podcast, I think, that series of books.
The amount of references and, oh, man, it would be that we're there all week on the first chapter, you know.
Yeah. Maybe that's something to think about in the future.
Maybe a mini-series in the future, yeah, maybe.
Of course, Block referenced it, as we've spoken about. But we can also think of things like Liebe's Our Lady of Darkness.
Yes.
We'd have very much that similar idea of this fascination with architecture, if I can put it that way, with the cityscape and being drawn into something. And of course, there was also the BBC Radio 4 podcast or series of podcasts. I believe the third or fourth series was called Haunter of the Dark. I did listen to the first two. I have to say I did start drifting out of those at that point. They had some good things about them, but, well, we can talk about those. Perhaps we'll do an episode on those at another time. But nonetheless, they do reference the Haunter of the Dark. Numerous graphic novels, of course, adaptations. And I used to have a copy of this. In 1979, Cadmon Records released an LP of a very good reading of the Haunter of the Dark by David McCallum, who'd previously done the Dunwich Horror and Rats in the Walls as releases as well. As I say, I had that on vinyl. I don't know what happened to it. I wish I still did, because that's probably worth a few bob now.
Probably, yeah.
Have to have a look on Discogs.
The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, their Dark Adventure Radio Theatre, did a version of Haunter of the Dark, which is absolutely tremendous, as you'd imagine.
Oh, I should get that as well. Yeah,
it's really good.
You know, I've never listened to any of those yet.
Not?
Those are on my. No,
I've got them all. They're amazing. I love them.
They're on the equivalent of my to-read list.
Oh, I absolutely love them. They're great. I've got all of them. So yeah, they're brilliant. They even did a version of Masks of Nyarlathotep. Yeah, which is it's long. Right. It's hours and hours and hours and hours, and it's absolutely brilliant stuff.
Wow. Well, that was a huge CIC campaign, and I think it was re-released a little while back. They sort of updated some aspects of it, I think, and excellent campaign. I think a lot of people rate that as probably the best RPG campaign of any system going. Masks, it really is fantastic. So, yes, lots of adaptations. And, you know, like I say, it is poignant to me to think that this was the last story that Lovecraft wrote, or at least that we know of, the last published story. Mm-hmm. And that it should end with a writer dying at his desk. You know, I don't think Lovecraft actually died. I imagine he was in hospital by that time. But nonetheless, there is that sense of him. He certainly kept a journal during his illness, right? Because I remember reading sections of that, and that was quite sad. I couldn't really get through it, charting the course of the disease that was ravaging him. So, yeah, and we can only speculate as to where he would have gone next. Would he have continued in this science fiction vein? If he had, I do think he would have sort of dove back into the mythos every now and again. Perhaps he would have done something else with Block. There would have been more collaborations who knows? We can only speculate.
Well, all we can really, like, adding to our speculation is the Commonplace book, which was basically like his version of my hundreds of notebooks that I have lying around the flat with just like random scribblings in them saying, a new penguin at London Zoo, which is actually one of the penguins from the Mountains of Madness, but it's not actually a penguin, it's a shoggoth in disguise. You know, this stuff I may never ever do anything with, but that was basically like Lovecraft's Commonplace book, wasn't it? Which is what Derleth then took and used to write what became known as his posthumous collaborations. They were best ideas he took
the
out.
Mask of Cthulhu and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, well, he wasn't that. He was the Watchers Out of Time. Was the ones. Yeah, Mask of Cthulhu. A lot of that stuff was written before Lovecraft's death.
Right.
He was the Watchers Out of Time. So it was things like Innsmouth Clay and The Shuttered Room, stories like that. They came from ideas out of Lovecraft's Commonplace book.
Well, there we go, folks. We hope you enjoyed that look of Haunter of the Dark. I think I agree with Tim. It's top tier Lovecraft, and it has all the elements of a great mythos story, and all those elements of a great Call of Cthulhu scenario as well. You can see, I think, things like this in the Dunwich Horror, you can really see the roots of COC role playing, can't you? In those sort of stories.
Yeah, definitely. It's. I would honestly put it up there in my sort of top 5 Lovecraft stories. I've always been a huge fan of Haunter. Really, really good story.
And as always, of course, we're very eager to hear your thoughts, your comments, your suggestions, your questions, or corrections, maybe on some pronunciation in there. Not quite as challenging as some of the Smith vocabulary, but you know.
No, there was a few though. there was a couple in there that I was like, one of which I was glad you read because I have no idea how to pronounce it. So I'm happy about that.
Well, I was very nervous about trapezohedron actually, but that seems to have gone all right. So.
Yeah, trapezohedron. Well, that's it. It's like tomato, isn't it? You're saying that way. I'm saying trapezohedron. Trapezohedron.
Hedron.
Yeah.
I know. I never know if it's hypnagogic or hypnagogic or hypnagogic.
Oh.
So I used that as a song lyric recently. Hypnagogic. Yeah, there we go. I'm sure someone more erudite than us, which is most of our listeners, I imagine.
Well, I think as well it's because we have 2 vastly different accents. so you've got even common words, we're pronouncing them completely differently. So I'm saying bath, you're saying bath.
Yeah. I was going to say glass.
Glass.
Butter.
Water.
See? Yeah. Well, vive la difference. That's what I say. Vive la difference.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, do let us know your thoughts, dear listener. Of course, you can get in touch with us via our Patreon site. You can get in touch with us on our Facebook page, on the YouTube channel. You can send us an email at innsmouthbookclub@outlook.com. Or you could try contacting us through the shining trapezohedron and beaming your thoughts through the cosmic gulfs of time and space. I'd probably go for email, actually, to be honest.
Yeah, it's probably easiest, isn't it?
Now, speaking of Patreon, we want to thank a few new patrons who have signed up recently. We'd like to say a big welcome and thanks to Ralph Grasso, Stu Price, Ekaterina Sayeva, and Niels Hedlin. Thank you very much for your support. If you'd like to join them in supporting the show, do check out our Patreon page. You can also subscribe to the show on Buzzsprout, which will get you bonus episodes, a copy of Innsmouth News every quarter, and various other goodies as well. Speaking of bonus episodes, I believe that's what we're going to be doing next time.
Indeed, we're going to be returning to the fungi from Yuggoth for our second part in our ongoing patron-exclusive delve into that mysterious and wonderful sonnet cycle.
I'm looking forward to that. There's so much stuff in there to get our teeth into, isn't there?
Oh, yeah.
It really is.
Yeah, we both tracked down a copy of the annotated fungi from Yuggoth from Hippocampus, and his turned up first, and he was saying, "Oh God, this is in depth." And I picked it up. It was just like, blimey.
Yeah. I think we thought when we were initially sort of floating the idea of looking at the fungi from Yuggoth, we thought, we'll do a couple of episodes on it. But looking at it now, I think this this is going to be quite a long-going series for our patrons.
Yeah.
Following that, we did receive the news of Roger Corman unfortunately passing away recently. So following the bonus episode, we're going to be returning to the Innsmouth Picture House, and we're going to be viewing and talking about Mask of the Red Death, one of my favourite films.
Quality film. Quality.
Okay, so that's it for now. Thanks for listening again, folks. Thanks for joining us in Innsmouth. Remember, always keep the lights on. And with that, it's goodbye from me, Rob Whiten.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.